to the Grace Hudson Museum. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Burton. I'm the director of the museum. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today for this program with Pam Valois and Susan Kanaan. So, I'd like to introduce Tony Wheeler. Tony is the president of the Sun House Guild, which is one of the nonprofit organizations that raises money for the museum that allows us to do our exhibitions and programs. Tony is also the manager of the museum's gift shop. And Tony first brought this idea to me, a few months ago. And, Tony, before the pandemic started, also created something called the Pop-Up Culture Club, which was founded to do interesting programs at different venues around town. And we partnered with her Pop-Up Culture Club on a number of occasions. And this actually started as a Pop-Up Culture Club event. So all praise to Tony for bringing this to us. And she's going to now do an introduction of our guest author and our guest interviewer. All right. Thanks again for being here today. Oh, one last note. If you haven't seen it already, our current exhibition is called Gathering Time. Pomo art during the pandemic. It's in that front gallery. I hope some of you might stay and take a look at that. If you don't do it today, I really urge you to come back and take a look. It's a wonderful show featuring 15 different contemporary Pomo artists from a number of the different tribal groups, Pomo tribal groups in Mendocino Lake and Sonoma County. And so anyway, I really urge you to come back and take a look at that. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you all. So is this audible now? Am I on here? Okay. I know there's another big party this afternoon, so thanks to everyone for coming here first. And that'll be a great event this afternoon too. I was delighted when Susan brought this idea to me a few months ago. I had not met Pam before, but the story that she's telling in her biography of Jacomena Maybeck is just fascinating, and I read the book recently and loved it, and I've been recommending it just as general great literature from since then. I was very, very happy a few weeks ago. I happened to be in Oakland for a family event, and Pam invited me and my friend Deborah to come visit her in her home, which is a Maybeck house in Berkeley. Just lovely and delightful. Susan and Pam gave me their intro here. We're college roommates way back when. Many of you know Susan here in Ukiah. Pam is a retired healthcare worker and photographer. She lives in Berkeley with her husband Lloyd, who is also here. Her book, Blooming in Winter, the story of a remarkable 20th century woman, won a gold medal in the 2022 Independent Publishers Book Awards in the West Pacific Division of the Best Regional Nonfiction. And Susan will interview Pam, read a few quotations as the voice of Jacomena Maybeck. And here we go. Oh, I would just like to say, books are available for purchase. They're $10. If you would like one, they're in the back of the room. We can do that here with cash or a check. If you need to use a credit card, please come see me in the gift shop afterwards, and we'll take care of that there. And it's a donation to the museum. Yes. So, thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony. I want to give a special thanks to Tony, who's been just a wonderful and delightful partner in this whole project to prepare for this event and plan it and stage it. And I want to thank you all for being here. What a pleasure to see so many friends in the audience. And I want to give, on everybody's behalf, a big welcome to Pam and Lloyd to Ukiah. So, to begin, Pam.
Yes.
How did you meet Jackie Maybeck, and what was she like?
All right. Well, it was the late 70s, and Lloyd and I were looking for a place to live in Berkeley, coming from San Francisco. And we heard about a cottage for rent, and we heard about this woman named Jacomena Maybeck. And so we made an appointment and drove up, came in the cottage gates, and looked around, didn't see her, and then we looked up on the roof, and there she was, a woman with sparkling blue eyes, a shock of white hair. She was very old. She was basically our age at that time. But she was dressed in bikini shorts and a halter top, and she was touring the roof. And we went on to, she did seem to like us, and we went on to rent the cottage. And by the way, the cottage always leaked. It leaked unbelievably, but she was going to tar that roof. So that's how we met her. She actually interviewed us in our own home in San Francisco. And then we lived across the street from her for several years. So what was she like? At the time, so she was in her late 70s. She was 77 or 78. And she was the steward of the small Maybeck houses that he built after the 1923 fire. You'll hear more about that later. But she was also a polished ceramicist. She was an award-winning ceramicist, and just this joyful, healthy, exuberant person. We had never known anyone like her. I mean, we knew our own parents, but this was a whole different thing. And her approach to life is what really inspired me. She knew how to throw a pot, obviously, but she could garden in the company of deer and skunks, and she could make plum jam. And her journals at the time I found to be really interesting. She was a poet and a storyteller. So I just wanted to read you one of her journals probably from 78. Billowy clouds today, pink flowers starting to bloom. I hope my 1980 is bright. I woke up to a blue sky and a chance for outdoor work, taming the overgrown bushes and moving in my new student. If you wake up and you write in your book, it's horrible weather, then you can just go on from there. It helps. Jackie knew how to balance dark thoughts with small pleasures. My floors are dirty. Russia is piling soldiers into Afghanistan, but there is one pure green and yellow primrose in bloom. And I mean, I wish I could be like she was. It was just wonderful. Well, the three of us, Lloyd and Jackie and I, became very good friends. We got married in the cottage after courting for 10 years. And then I was a photographer at the time, and I started being afraid that I would lose her because, as I said, she seemed very old. And I started photographing her all over the place, in her garden, in her pot shop, in her fireplace, in front of her fireplace. You could actually go into her fireplace, it was that big. And she introduced us to other friends, and the whole model of aging just changed for me. And out of that came a book that I have on the back table I'd love you to look at. It's called Gifts of Age, and it features 32 women who were 70 and over. And the women were not famous. There is two famous people in the book, but basically the women were doing things they loved, and they weren't doing them for anything else, just for their own pleasure. So that's a little picture of her, Susan.
So fast forward many decades, how did you come to write Blooming in Winter?
Well, we stayed close friends with Jackie Maybeck, and she died in 1996 at the age of 95, which is a lot longer than I thought anyone would live. So 9 years ago, we were lucky enough to buy her house, and I started researching the house. And I started noticing things like photographs of other people living in her house, which was supposed to be her house, and also things like strange cutouts in the ceiling, or maybe a square in the floor that had been repaired. And I was trying to understand more about it when I realized the story was not about the house, the story was about Jackie. And one of the hard things was we were what, Lloyd? We were 34. And we were too young and stupid, unless there's anyone in this room that's that age, but we didn't ask her about what was it like to grow up, where did you grow up? And we kind of knew from reading her memoirs, which are also in the back, if you can have a look at, We knew she grew up somewhere out here, but we just weren't that curious. And so, what was I going to finish with that? I was going to say that one of my favorite things in doing the research was that her grandchildren gave me a copy of what was called the Ranch Log, and it was a dialogue of 10 years of people coming and going to the ranch out on Pine Ridge Road, with lots of little drawings and photographs. So to me, that was the favorite thing I discovered in researching the book.
And that's where I come into the story, right?
Yes. Now we turn the page. So Susan said, well, my God, I've heard of Pine Ridge Road. It's right out on Low Gap Road, and I live right here. And so Susan knew Gina Campbell. If you would just raise your hand, Gina, for 1 second. Thank you. Gina became interested in the project and introduced us to Noni and Jerry Cheney, who recently moved from Pine Ridge Road back into Ukiah. And everyone was so helpful with the research. So Susan and I said, well, why don't we just go try and find the ranch? Maybe it's still there. Maybe there's a building. We didn't exactly have an address, but
we had Gina.
We had Gina. So Jackie's daughter Cherry had written this vivid description of the road, which we finally got a hold of.
It took an hour to drive the 10-mile ribbon of writhing, life-supporting road connecting Ukiah and Pine Ridge. It wound through hot hills of smooth tan grass sprinkled with live oak trees. It forded summer day creeks filled with dogwood and cool lichen-covered rocks. It went past the Signet's shack, past the schoolhouse and the buggy shed, and down the long, curving, sunny south grade to the well-tended orchard of the Katurbas, from where the gates began, to be opened and closed again for passage over the neighbor's land. Following the creek, the road narrowed, banks high and unyielding on one side, against which car fenders rubbed as drivers carefully negotiated the curves, astutely avoiding the precipitous drop to the busy creek on the other side. Only the familiar or very courageous would have found their way this far. There was no turning back.
So doesn't that sound intriguing? So Susan and I were very challenged by this. And I'm going to read from the book. Susan and I set out on Low Gap Road, then veered onto Pine Ridge Road, where we slowly navigated the deep potholes of the narrow country road, remembering Jackie's stories of traveling in mud and rain. The landscape became more verdant, with boundless meadows and mature oaks blanketed in lichen and moss. We followed Ore Creek, and then entered the Robinson Creek watershed, which used to supply salmon to homesteaders. As my city car rounded Devil's Elbow, feral horses galloped straight towards us, then disappeared, leaving us breathless. Neighbors in trucks stopped to inch past us and ask our business. We picked up Susan's friend, Gina Campbell, who lives on Pine Ridge Road with her husband. She guided us to the home of Noni and Jerry Cheney, who live farther out Pine Ridge Road. And while we savored Noni's wildberry cobbler, she told us that her grandparents, Annie and Anthony Dory, bought their land in 1913, the same year that Jackie's parents, the Van Husens, had bought their land. They had bought 100 acres. To my surprise, Noni flipped the pages of her scrapbook to a deed for a piece of property sold to her father, Albert, in 1941 by Annie Maybeck, who was Bernard Maybeck's wife. And on an old map, the Maybeck's land appears right next to the Van Husen house. I never saw anything else like this. It was only in Noni's scrapbook that we saw this. When I showed Noni and Jerry a picture of the Van Husen house, with just a little drawing, they both said in chorus, "That's Maury's house. It's still there." So we were hopeful. As we explored their property, which was an oasis with a pond, gardens, and waterfalls, Noni led the way up a hill and pointed to the largest tree in view, one ancient redwood that now wholly conceals the Van Heusen house. As a young child, Jackie's father used to climb the ridge in his tall black boots and big coat en route to town for supplies, and would stop by Noni's house to visit on the way back. I was thrilled to be right there, so close to the ranch that Jackie adored. I could understand how she longed for this countryside with its endless vistas, sweet smells of clover and sunshine. Now I was eager to explore the old Van Heusen property, but I would have to wait longer for permission to pass through the private gates to the ranch.
That brings back so many wonderful memories for me. It was a vivid day. It's been a few years, still vivid in my memory. So a lot of us here are interested in what Jackie's early life was like, including her many years in Mendocino County, which I figured it was actually many decades that she had a connection to Mendocino County.
Yeah, like 5 or 6, yes. So, excuse me. So Jackie was actually an immigrant. Her father was a sugar chemist and worked all over the world. And in this particular case, she wrote that my mother said, "This time I'm going with you." And so they went together and Jackie was born, and that was in Java. Very glamorous place to be born, I think. So soon they moved back to Holland, and Jackie writes about memories that she has of her huge extended family where the 80-year-old grandmothers rode their bikes back and forth to each other's houses. So they were, I think she was maybe 4 or 5 when she had those memories. And then Jackie's Uncle Nick wrote that he had found a gold mine in California and invited the Van Heusens to come out to California. And much to my surprise, they did. So Jackie, who is 6 years old, and again has some sort of vague memories of coming across the country in a train. She wasn't sure exactly what they did, but of course by the time they arrived, the gold mine had petered out. There was really no gold mine. And so they eventually made their way up to Crockett, where Jackie's father worked in the sugar refinery. And then the connection to the Maybecks starts right around now. Uncle Nick pops up again, and he had married a young woman named Amy Flagg. And Bernard Maybeck, who wasn't that familiar at the time, I think, with the Ukiah country, Bernard had been convinced to build a house for Mr. Flagg, and it was 3 miles out on Low Gap Road. So Jackie's family and the Flaggs spent lots of time together. Jackie talks about how for years they would camp in this, they would come up for the whole summer while the father was down working and just camp outside. So Susan will read.
One day in 1911, Nick and my family were cooking and cleaning up a storm. The Maybecks were coming, and they might buy land. The country in summer smells like nothing else, sweet and warm and dry and sun-clean. The Maybecks came down the trail shouting and singing, father, mother, son, and daughter Kerna. Maybeck's Pooh Bear figure, the beard, the sparkling eyes, were all there and stayed in my life from then on. He was very kind, he was sociable, he was interested in people, he was gentle.
So that's where it began, their connection. The Maybecks did buy 2,000 acres, compared to Jackie's measly little bit. And the Maybecks loved to camp. They camped on Pine Ridge Road for years, and they built what Jackie calls a half-a-log cabin. And there's actually, in one of Jackie's memoirs in the back, you can see a cute little out-of-focus picture of half of the log cabin. So at that time, Jackie was 10 years old when she met Wallen, and she promised herself she would marry him. And so her parents fell in love with the Ukiah country and I said that they bought the 100 acres, and then they rented a house in Ukiah for a while so Jackie could go to school. and the father went off to Cuba to make money for the ranch. And so we think Jackie was about 14 or 15 when they could fully live on the ranch. And then Susan's going to tell a little bit about how that began.
Now we had to make a dirt road to our 100 acres and build a house. First, a level path to the large flat knoll not too far from a never dry spring. Next, we made a path up the hill to a little forest of pines. My brother and I trimmed and peeled them, and all 4 of us carried them down the hill, too steep for the horse. Enough poles to make the framework for the house. Mother and Dad worked like horses to maintain the ranch, and so did my brother and I, and it was neat and cared for, raked and clean. The ridge lay to the west, and sometimes white fog floated over it. Down in our meadow, there were little woods of manzanita trees, red trunks and little bellflowers in January. You knew where they were when you heard the bees buzzing. Spring was mad with wildflowers. Summer sizzled with heat and was canning time. Autumn crisped the air and we cut wood for winter. Winter was weather and isolation.
Well, the Van Huysens, when they finally did move there, they lived very independently, and they really didn't have a ranch. As far as I know, they didn't even have chickens, but they grew flowers, they planted an orchard, they grew tons of fruit, and then they could exchange the fruit for venison and eggs from neighbors. Well, those years on the ranch, they created or reinforced Jackie's hardiness, her rural skills, and her confidence. She wrote,
That's probably where I learned to make do. If you wanted a chair, you built it. If you wanted a house, you built it. I learned from my own family and from the Maybecks that work is the most fun you can have. Pleasure is work, but real work is more pleasure. I can't explain it.
and that comes right from a video of Jackie that's on the website of the Berkeley Historical Society. It's my favorite. I can't explain it, she says. Well, the ranch became the secure base that Jackie had not had since leaving Holland, and it would remain so for the rest of her parents' lives.
So Jackie lived such a long and rich life, it's impossible for you to describe it in detail. That's why we read the book. But can you tell us about some of the key stages in her life?
Well, after Jackie graduated from Ukiah High School, she taught at a little school on Pine Ridge Road, which later Susan and I will ask if anyone knows anything about, because we were fascinated. She was saving money for college. They had no other money. And she had gotten into UC Berkeley, and she arrived in 1923. So 1923 was, in September of 1923, was the year of the huge Berkeley fire, which burned 500 homes, including Bernard Maybeck's gigantic home, which had burned to the ground. So Jackie wanted to study art, but instead she studied education courses, and she said they were very boring. But they would give her a way to make money, which she knew she would eventually need. So Jackie would return again and again to the ranch over the next several decades.
We always spent vacations on the ranch. I began to long for the blue sky of the ranch. Mostly we canned fruit, gardened a lot, and once a week went into town for supplies. Father was usually at a sugar mill making money for the rest of the year. When the brothers met our train, we were home and driving up the deep, rutted road, and college was way back there. At home were hot drinks and a glowing stove and homemade Christmas presents. They clutched at the heart with love. Rain drumming, we were totally alone at the end of our string bean road. The deep love of this place churned in my heart. The day ended in deep sleep under a pile of quilts.
So now it's 1927, and Jackie is just graduating from college, and the whole time she had been dating Wallen But she especially says in her memoir she dated other men to make sure she was attractive. But she still knew she was going to marry Wallen. And so right after she graduated, imagine, where did she go? The ranch, right? She goes to the ranch and she writes in her diary, "Can I ever be a one-man woman?" Well, by September, she declared, "I finally decided to marry him." And then in her memoir, she wrote, "Well, I married Wallen and became Jacomena Maybeck, and that name is still music to my ears." Beautiful way of putting it. So soon Jackie became pregnant, and this was a little bit of the beginning of what I call Jackie escapes Berkeley and the Maybeck compound. So she moved her family out to Marin, deciding to have the baby in the hospital there. And when she had the baby, it turns out she had twins. But neither she nor the doctor had known that she would have twins. So Jackie remembers Wallen saying, "My God, there are two of them." And then she passed out. And later when she woke up, she said, "Oh, that's wonderful, because we can give one to Thea, my cousin." Her cousin had been trying to get pregnant at the same time. So she was a little delusionary. Well, Jackie adored her mother and, of course, took the twins up to the ranch for help and comfort. Well, Wallen stayed down in Berkeley. He worked in San Francisco.
I just picked up the babies and I went. Wallen would come up on Friday nights. We worked on the road, cut wood, made a little swimming hole for the twins.
And here's another favorite story from those times.
For me too. I asked Cherry, one of their twins, "You're a sweetheart, aren't you?" "No, me's a Maybeck," she replied. Sheila is almost never without a kitty. It's so dry and barren that the deer are desperate and have started breaking through the orchard fence. These last dead days before the early fall change comes are pretty bad. Tempers and nerves get rather frazzled, and we feel like Kansas farmers looking for rain.
So when the twins were 4 years old, Bernard Maybeck designed a house for Jackie's family, and that is the house called High House. It's the house that Lloyd and I now live in. And Jackie was thrilled to finally have a house of her own. She'd been living in some of the small houses that Maybeck had built after the fire, and she really, according to her diary, thought this house was hers, and she could do whatever she wanted in it. She had lots of parties and lots of gatherings. Her best friend wrote stories about some of the parties, which were really fascinating. But after 3 years, the kids were just 7, her daughter wrote, "It was too clobbering, too close with the family. Jackie was a powerful person and did not like to be constantly monitored and asked questions." And so they again moved. And that was one of the times when the senior Maybecks moved into our house, which is one of the photographs that I saw and was puzzled by. The other thing that Jackie had longed for, or I wouldn't say the other thing, one thing she had longed for was creative work. She had longed for this ever since she could remember. And just before she decided to marry Wallen, she was living in Portland, and she wrote him a very, very long letter that Susan will read just a bit from.
I haven't a clear idea yet what I'll do down there, because what I want most is expressive activity. The field somehow doesn't matter so much because I haven't any decided talent or interests outside of people, gardens, adventures, dogs, horses, and the ranch, traveling, stage work, and you.
However, she never mentioned children. Oh well. Well, Jackie really had not had time to develop anything creative of her own, maybe besides gardening, which I call very creative. And so she and Wallen spent time in Germany, in post-war Germany, And Jackie was then introduced to ceramics at that time and totally fell in love with it.
I found that pottery and clay were the only things that satisfied me at all.
And when they returned from Germany, Jackie enrolled in the California College of Arts and Crafts and got a master's degree. And she then taught there for years and finally found her creative work. So now we go to the 1950s. If you can follow this, the nice thing is Jackie was born in 1901, so you just have to subtract, when you see the 1950s. So the 50s was a horrible decade for Jackie and Wallen. First, both of Jackie's parents died. And basically, even though her father had stayed on the ranch a bit longer after the mother died, he eventually died. And they sold the ranch, and so that ended her time with Ukiah, essentially. And then soon after that, Annie Maybeck died, and then after that, Bernard Maybeck died. And so now we're in the 60s. And the 60s, there's a picture in my story on page 144. And it's a beautiful photograph taken by a photographer, not myself. And it's a picture of Jackie and Maybeck in our house, beautifully lit. Wallen's he's got his pipe in his hand in his mouth, and Jackie's petting her cat. And it's just this idyllic picture, dated 1960. Wallen had retired at the time. They had several grandchildren. And all the family had died, so guess what? I think she finally felt the house was her own. But, bam, in 1961, Wallen died. And it was sad because his parents had lived to be into their 90s. And it plunged Jackie into widowhood at an early age 61.
I was bowed down with responsibilities and cares without anyone to discuss it with, without asking for help. Before, I had felt utterly irresponsible and frivolous. Things would always come out all right. There was Wallen, the family, and the land to count on.
And when Lloyd and I met Jackie, she'd been a widow for 17 years. I asked her how she felt about it.
These years since Wallen died, these years are like a tree that began to put out little leaves and blossoms, where before it was a bare tree. It began to grow. You begin to find yourself. You change your format and your attitude toward things. Being a widow gives you tremendous freedom suddenly, more than you can handle at times. I think of freedom now as something you have to work for very hard.
And Jackie did spend the rest of her life as a widow. But when we knew her in the late 70s, she was blooming. She was the steward of the Maybeck homes. She was giving talks and tours and writing books. She was by then an award-winning ceramicist.
The creative person has to create something for himself to do, something that's not a fast pleasure. I don't think you can stop being creative. You might say you're tired out and can't do anything else, and the first thing you know, you're digging in the garden, or you wander by the pot shop and you start fiddling with the clay. Wherever I go, part of my mind is looking, and sifting through ideas. It's there always, always.
At age 80, Jackie wrote a loving memoir of her father-in-law, Bernard Maybeck. It's back on the back, called Maybeck, The Family View. And then when she was 91, she wrote her own memoir called People and Places. And I wanted to ask Susan to read from the last chapter, this is how it begins.
Age is a damn nuisance. You have to work harder for everything, but magic things still happen. I do have a job still. It is the care of the 4 houses that are my income and my home. They're like children, always a problem. A leak in the roof, a sewer stopped up. And there's what I call grandmother gardening. While seated, you can read and plant a flower bed as wide as your arm is long. Long-handled pointed hoes are great. Toy rakes, the very best pruning shears, several kinds, and keep them sharp. So these years, it's house and dinners and garden.
Thank you.
So, what was being part of the famous Maybeck family like for Jackie? There's a big question.
Yeah, we're going to have a small answer. Well, Jackie and Ben really did become close friends and kindred spirits. They were both artists, and they both liked to experiment with materials, for one thing. Jackie became famous for her glazes, and Maybeck, as some of you may know, experimented all his life with materials, particularly materials to prevent fire, which I'll talk about in a minute. In 1979, Alan Temko, the architectural critic for the San Francisco Chronicle, wrote a lovely introduction to Jackie's book about Bernard Maybeck. He said in part, "Of all the Maybecks, each paddling a separate canoe on the high seas of independent family life, Jacomena seemed to me the most strangely lovely. It was in the freedom of her presence, unanchored, but so perfectly attached, not only to Wallen, but to that intangible Maybeck quality which she helped to shape as much as any of them except Annie. Her devotion to Ben, the soft glancing attention that had in it the understanding of a true spiritual daughter, herself an artist, was part of the overall mood as much as the quick warmth of sunlight when the fog straggled out of the eucalyptus." So still, Jackie did have a hard time living in close quarters with the Maybecks, and she moved back and forth in and out of the compound for years. Her Dutch sense of independence served her well, though, and we wanted to just let you know how she talked about her mother-in-law. And perhaps why she moved once in a while.
We're both mothers-in-law, so we try not to identify too much. Annie was a little Scotch-Irish fighter, a spitfire. She buzzed like a mosquito. When I was first married, it was a life and death struggle. I felt that my personality was going to melt down into the Maybeck family and never be heard of again. I suddenly realized that I had the privilege of being myself, my own person, separate from them. I had to fight for it in myself because I'd been carefully trained to be very respectful of older people. And to suddenly feel that I had the right to not accept the burdens they were trying to push on me, that was a big battle I won, and I've coasted on it ever since.
And then back to the question about being part of Maybeck's family. So when Jackie was a teenager and doing all that camping with Maybeck, she just thought he was a kind old guy with a beard. But she came to know him suddenly as an architect.
While we rode horses and watched sunsets up on the ridge, Maybeck was even busier than we. He mystified the local Western Union office, sending strange, enigmatic telegrams about niches and beams, corbels, and pediments. We did not know what he was doing. What he was doing was the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco.
And that was in 1915, so she was 14, right? Yeah. Well, you can see how Maybeck loved nature. And with his houses that he built, he was passionate about having indoor-outdoor spaces. He wanted people to be able to roll their beds out onto sleeping porches and also roll their dining room tables outside and eat outside. One of my favorite quotes from him is, "Hillside architecture is landscape gardening around a few rooms for use in case of rain." So, and then just to touch on what I said earlier, for Bernard Maybeck, fire was a life-changing presence and an ongoing influence. He had lost his office after the San Francisco earthquake, and then he lost his home in 1923. And so he started experimenting with materials, and you may have heard of the bubble stone that's still on 2 houses in Berkeley. And they were just gunny sacks dipped in colored cement and hung like shingles on the side of the house. And he built cement houses with galvanized roofs. And then I like to talk about this one because it happened to Lloyd's in my house in 1938, which seems to be another time that the Maybecks were living in our house, we finally figured out. Annie was making some potatoes in oil on the stove.
It was donuts.
Lloyd says it's donuts, I say it was potatoes. But somewhere Jackie said, Maybeck only ate donuts and coffee all day, lunch, dinner, and Annie ate a small steak and a piece of cheese or something. So it could have been donuts, but nevertheless, when they started back up the hill, the house was completely on fire. The fire department had been called, but all the windows and the entire roof had blown out of our house. And so now if you come and visit, you'll see a beautifully charred inside house. They wire brushed it, and as Lloyd would say, Maybeck was how old when he got up on the rafters and worked on the house?
I think he was 78.
78, there we go again, my age. So, Susan, your turn.
It makes it very beautiful, though, I can attest, so can Tony. So, a final question takes us back to your book. You called your book Blooming in Winter, so why did you choose to emphasize that in your title?
Well, first of all, we met her when she was in the winter of her life. And she was just blooming at the time. As I said earlier, so many things had changed. Widowhood had particularly changed her.
I've gone into so many things I didn't do before, like writing a book with Flo, or my book about Ben. They called Bernard Maybeck Ben. We were asked to give a talk, and suddenly I felt a great satisfaction in feeling that somehow I'd acquired a point of view and usefulness that I'd never had before. By rolling into it, you begin to find out what you have in your own head and do something about it. That's what the books were. A lot of relationships developed, and that's been so satisfying. You become a personality instead of being just a person.
And maybe at that time, Jackie finally felt the house was her own. She rented rooms out to students. She didn't live alone for all those years. There were always 2 or 3 students sharing meals and helping around the house. She could make her own decisions, and of course she could use the skills that she'd honed on the ranch. And I want to read one little quote from her. She said, "My friends were getting wobbly. Was the hill to the house getting steeper? I decided to build a railing, and I hired a young neighbor to help. So up the hill beyond the house, we found 2 tall saplings, and with my axe, I made the sacrifice. We oiled them with linseed oil and lashed them to the post. It looked as if it had always been there. It looked just right. And those railings are still there, actually." So, just summing up, I hope we've given you an idea of what this amazing woman was like. She drew on her experience of growing up a ranch girl in a strong and empowering family, and she transformed the experience into the identity of a woman that included running electric cement mixers and cutting brush to keep warm. She relished road work and holding a grandchild. I'm going to start that sentence over. But she relished road work and holding a grandchild at least as much as she did throwing a pot or writing a story. She died in 1996 at age 95, leaving us with the indelible impressions of a woman who lived life in a special way and inspired so many of us who loved her. So thank you for letting us share this story.
So before we have have some conversation with all of you, any questions or comments that you have. I want to again express our thanks to the museum, Grace Hudson Museum, for hosting us and being so welcoming and helping us publicize the event and helping in so many ways. Again, our thanks to Tony for everything that she did. Thank to all of you for coming. And above all, many thanks to Pam Valois for this wonderful work. For making the film, which will be eventually available in a little bit.